Well, thank you very much for having me here. I am Darcy Leach, and I wrote From My Mother, which published last month, and it is the story of surviving and thriving in a family ravaged by genetic disease. And the message in it is one of resilience and human connection and hope. And with that, there really is a lot of universal philosophical principles in it that are good for where we're going. So I do have second reading there, and I'll read from you out of this in just a bit. And it's going to contain a Psalm of Life with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. But to get you there, I want to show you some pictures first. So in my life, I am the healthy child of a woman born with myotonic muscular dystrophy, and my brother inherited the gene too. And in my life, this is me meeting my brother for one of the first times. Dustin was born when I was 3, and he was born in Arkansas, but then he was life-flighted to Tennessee, and then he was taken to Wilford Hall, which is one of the best Air Force hospitals in Texas, before I got to meet him. And before I got to meet him, my father took me in a moving truck, actually, and we had this big, long drive where we talked, and my father was talking to a 3-year-old, but he was talking to me about complex things like birth defects, possible genetic diseases, and that there was a good chance that I would outlive my brother. And people have asked me questions like, how did having myotonic dystrophy in the family change your life? And I really don't have an answer for that, because the answer is myotonic dystrophy has shaped my life. Even though I don't carry it, I'm not affected. I have a genetic test to know that I'm healthy. It's always been part of where I've been. And this is another picture of my brother and I, and this is the girl that was raised being told that she would outlive her brother. I was raised in a family where we wanted to appreciate each day. We looked at each day as a gift. We wanted to live in the moment. We wanted the chance to enjoy life with Dustin as long as we had him. And you know what? It worked. That little girl is happy. And when I was little, faith seemed really easy, because children with congenital myotonic muscular dystrophy, if they can get out of the hospital, their body gets stronger and stronger. You really don't see weakening or degeneration in the children. So I would pray, and I would pray to God. I'd say, please let my brother walk. Please give me another day with Dustin. Please heal my brother. And they originally predicted that Dustin would die before he got out of the hospital. He had to have open heart surgery. He had to have oxygen. He had to have a feeding tube. They didn't think he would make it. And the truth is, in 1989, when he was born, to be third generation of identifiable myotonic dystrophy, he was a medical miracle. Doctors would pay for sleep studies, so we'd take Dustin to the hospital and make money off of it, because he was such a rare anomaly to survive with that many protein repeats, creating the muscle weakness. But in that, when I saw Dustin get stronger and stronger, it was very easy to think, my prayers matter. Faith is doing that. And in fact, my father would kind of indulge me in the habit, and it fits childhood, but I would hang out in a lot of hospitals or hotels or malls when we were waiting for Dustin to get out of the hospital. And all of those have one thing in common in the 90s, and that's wishing wells. And my father would always give me a coin, or I'd scrounge one out of the bottom of the wishing well, if we're being honest. But I would wish the same thing every time, and it'd be real simple. And one day, my father asked me what I wished when I threw it in a well when Dustin was having surgery. And I'd pray every time for the same thing in a wishing well. And I'd say, God, let Dustin walk one day. Let Dustin be healed. And I'd throw that well in, that coin in the well. And I thought as a child that my prayers, if I prayed hard enough, they'd be answered. That if I prayed in the right ways, I'd get what I asked for. That if I threw a coin in a wishing well enough times, my wish would come true. That's how my faith was as a child. And these are kind of the golden years. I have knobby knees, but I'm healthy. My mom she looks normal. And in fact, at this point, she really is. She has she has adult onset myotonic muscular dystrophy, which means she wasn't identified as having it until Dustin was born. And truthfully, she could do most things at this point, except that she has a high-needs son at home, so she does things like work less hours. But she's fully functional at that point. And my dad's in the military, and you know what? The military had really good insurance in the 90s, so we were pretty well taken care of. We maxed out our deductible every year, but Could have been a lot worse. And Dustin, at this point in grade school, actually in a special education room, they would have built a rail set, and he had surgery on his ankles, so they pulled the tendon tighter to try to correct his club foot, and he would wear braces and with somebody helping him. So they'd put a belt on him, they'd put braces on him, and they'd have the rails. He could walk about 3 steps that way. And this is the era of progress. This is where those prayers that the child was praying who is happy in those other pictures, they seem like they're being answered. Life seems to make sense. Things seem to be going really well. And you know what? They were. And living with my brother taught me to appreciate the simple joys in life. This is White Sands, New Mexico. Anybody been there? I've been there about 20 times in my life, maybe 30, because every time we go to Alamogordo, that's where my mom's family is from, we always go out to White Sands. This is one of my favorite pictures because it reminds me of the simple joys in life. My brother was nonverbal, so he wasn't complicated by things like material wealth. He didn't compete with me or call me names. He didn't seem to envy. He didn't seem to covet. Instead, life's simple joys really mattered. So White Sands is a beautiful natural setting. And here he is. My dad buried him in the sand, and he got a real kick out of that. But on top of that, he's taking the sand and he's just throwing it in the air, and he's taking nature's gift and throwing it into nature's system and letting gravity naturally take it down. And that's a huge joy in his life. And to be around that day in, day out as a child, I too came to value those simple joys, maybe even to the point where I was judgmental of people who didn't find those simple joys or chased success too much or chased whatever too much. But my brother seemed to epitomize the simple joys in life. And being around that was such a beautiful blessing. But this picture, when I told you that children with congenital myotonic muscular dystrophy, that's a mouthful, isn't it? They tend to get stronger and stronger. Puberty is their trial by fire. And if you look real close in this picture, my brother's starting to get a little bit of a unibrow because puberty is hitting him. And this is actually my brother's last family vacation. And when I was 16, my brother wore diapers all of his life. We had to get him out of bed. We had to brush his hair. We had to brush his teeth, bathe him, that kind of thing. And there was one morning, I was 16. I was waking up for high school. I was getting ready to get my brother ready for school. He had a cold. He had been home the last day, but usually Dustin only missed a day or two of school before he'd go back. But I had some extra time on my hands. And in a family with a child with a lot of special needs, you don't always have a lot of extra time. So I was on the social media of the era, MSN Messenger. Anybody remember that? Yeah, and I was just wasting time. And it was like, oh, this feels kind of nice, a little bit of extra time in the day. But my brother had been sick that Friday, and it was a Monday, and he still wasn't going to school. And I remember getting my backpack on and walking up the stairs and grabbing the door to leave. And my brother was napping in the living room. And I remember stopping and looking at my brother and waiting for his chest to rise and his chest to fall. And I saw that, and I felt comforted. And I walked out the door and I went to school. And second hour, and some of you might know her, Mrs. Gunn's chemistry class, Miss Seaton, toughest class I've ever taken maybe, taking a big test, and there's a phone call, and Miss Seaton answers it, and she says, yes, but she's taking a test. And then as somebody else is saying something, she looks at me, and she says, oh, I see. I'll send her right down. And she says, Darcy, you need to head to the office. And there's this big sense of alarm. I don't know what it is. I try to stay calm. As soon as I walk out into the hallway, and this is one of those weird moments in life. I don't know if I told myself this, if I heard it or what, but as soon as I walk into that hallway, my head says, Darcy, your brother is dead. And I say, no, that can't be. It's just a cold. He's survived so many colds. But I'd been trained since age 3 to expect that day, to expect the day my brother would pass away. I took a drink at the water fountain. I tried to shake it off. I walked to the office. I think I could still hear those footsteps in my head. Some of those moments in time are just ingrained in our brains. But I walk into the office, and my parents are both there. And my dad has his arm around my mother, and he says, your mom has something she wants to tell you. My mom has tears in her eyes, and before she says anything, I just say, I know. And I don't know if it's because we're connected or because you can feel those types of things, or it's just enough logical clues being raised that way that one day when your parents show up at school, you know your brother's dead. But when that moment came, I didn't cry. I stood there and I smiled at my parents. And I thought, you know what? I have been raised for this. I can handle this. I'm calm. I'm smooth. And I didn't know what to feel. And then the principal, after me standing there awkwardly smiling at my parents for about a minute, invited us into a private room, pulled out chairs, closed the door, and as soon as I sat down, I wailed. I bawled. It's the most primal feeling of loss that I've ever felt. Because even though I'd been raised to expect my brother to die, the moment I was told about, I could handle it. But thinking about moving on without him, I was at a loss for. And that's where faith isn't quite as simple. The girl who prayed and threw quarters in wishing wells hoping for a cure to an incurable disease that was in her family didn't get that answer. And it shook my faith. And in From My Mother, I end one of the chapters like this, talking about my unclear purpose after losing my brother after years of prayer. He was gone, and I was left. The race against the clock of his terminal disease was gone, and the pain was left. The hope was gone, and the anger was left. My prior way of life was gone, but I was left. And that girl that was hopeful, that threw coins in wells, that was kind of the stalwart of faith in her family because she was the faith like a child example, I was angry at God. I was mad. I thought, God, why did you give me such a beautiful example of a brother, someone so simple and pure that it seemed like he was a life from heaven here? Why'd you give me that? Take it away and make me go back to high school where people are going to talk about getting stoned, getting drunk, hating their parents, not wanting to be here, and maybe even self-harming. Why was he going to throw me back into that? And I asked God, what purpose do I have? Why am I here? Why was I born healthy? Why'd you give me a brother who would pass away when I was 16 and a mom who carries the disease and will be affected and give me all these gifts so that I can run on the basketball court as my brother's sitting in his wheelchair in the stands? Why'd you put me here? Why'd you keep me here? And why do I have to go on after you took my brother? And those were really hard moments. I didn't have a clear purpose. But that same year when I'm 16, I am in American Literature English class, and I get to read works like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, William Wordsworth, or Walt Whitman. And I love the Transcendentalists. I do. I majored in English in college. I taught AP language for 7 years, and that's the heartstring for me, is those natural poets there. And I was flipping through my literature book, and I found a Psalm of Life. It wasn't even required reading, actually. We never read it in class, but I read it myself, and I thought, this is for me. And since that day, when I was 16, I took that poem home, I wrote it, I rewrote it, I memorized it. And it's not because I was in forensics doing poetry competitions, because I wasn't, but I have had a Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow memorized since I was 16. And here's part of why. Because when I had an unclear purpose, poetry told me this: tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. My brother had passed away, but the grave was not its goal. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Actually, I haven't told this story to too many people, but when I was 16, I was down in my bedroom, and I had a picture that I had bought because it reminded me of my brother. My brother was really super flexible, and it was a seal that was looking backwards at the camera, because my brother, with his loose muscles, he could do that. And I put that picture up on my wall, and my brother didn't sign his name because he didn't write, but he used a stamp, and I stamped that picture with his name. And I had prayed a lot that night, and I felt a little lost, but I had a dream, and I had a dream of my brother. And we were in Carlsbad Caverns, which is in New Mexico, around the same area as White Sands. And in this dream, my brother is in Carlsbad Caverns with us, which is also one of the last places we'd go. We went there the same time we went to White Sands. But my brother's in Carlsbad with me, and my brother walks to me in my dream. And my brother says, "It's okay, Darcy, I'm in a better place." And he hugs me. And you might think I'm lying, but here's how I wake up. That picture of the seal fell off the wall, and I woke up. And I've thought since that moment that my brother, I've known since that moment that my brother is okay, that he is watching out for me and that he is with me. And it's poetry like this that helped me go through that, because you know what? When you pray to God all your life and then your brother dies anyway, sometimes it's hard to find it in the Bible. But sometimes in poetry and real human experiences, sometimes it's still there. So I had an unclear purpose as a 16-year-old, but these lines are about purpose. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow says, "Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act that each tomorrow find us farther than today." And that became my mantra. I knew this poem. I memorized this poem. I said it like 3 times a day to myself, saying, I will create a life of meaning by using poetry as the guide. And this is how I lived for a while. I tried to let my parents know that they were successful in raising their children by me finding myself farther, by building progress, by trying to make meaning of my life through that. And this poem really carried me through. It helped me get through that junior year of high school, because when you're 16, emotions are hard anyway, but you add in a death in the family and you're kind of lost. But poetry, this poem, 3 times a day, memorized when I had to wash my hands for 2 minutes for something in medical investigations class. This is what I would recite for 2 minutes. If I had to calm my nerves when I was in athletics, like about to shoot a free throw, I'd recite this in practice, or before the game, or in the batter's box. If I had to give a big speech, I would recite this poem. This really was what calmed my brain, what helped me find purpose, what let me know that life on earth wasn't the end goal necessarily, but while we were here, we could still find meaning. This picture is really important to me. I took this picture at age 11, and I wrote about it in college. And one of my college professors told me, "Darcy, this is one of the most important pieces of poetry I've seen. You got to try to publish this. This is great." And I said, "No, I can't," because this talked about the way I really felt. And I was masking that. I was trying to be successful. I was trying to prove to people that it was okay by getting as high of a GPA as I could, by making it seem like I had it all together. This picture hung on my wall in high school, and I took it with me to college. A poem about it, and I'm going to read you the last couple lines. I said, "I took the picture, age 11, capturing the pinnacle arc of the sun to my lilac, who outlived him and weeps still. Their sky has staple holes. Maybe that's how the light leaked out." And I cried when I wrote that poem, and I revised that poem like 6 times because it was for a creative writing class. And I cried almost every time I revised it. And it was this one space where I could be alone with the words and acknowledge my feelings and let it happen. Because the people in the creative writing class, they didn't know my mom. They weren't going to go tell my mom. They weren't going to go tell my dad that I thought there was some sense of loss in my parents, and that affected me. It was poetry that helped me get through it from 16 on, and it was poetry in college that helped me process it. And I didn't publish this poem until I was 25. Because when I was 25, my mother ends up in the hospital, unable to breathe on her own. And she seemed perfectly normal before, but I knew what she had. My brother had been in big city hospitals when my dad was in the Air Force. He had gotten great medical attention. He was a medical anomaly because it was so rare. But the genetic anticipation made it more visible in him than my mother. And my mother carried an adult onset form that was incurable. And when she was in the hospital, I didn't think the odds looked very good. She had pneumonia. They said if they could get rid of the pneumonia, maybe they could regain muscle strength and she could live out the rest of her natural life, whatever that would be. But there was one moment where I'm talking to the doctor, and my mom's medical records were in the National Archives in St. Louis, because when my dad retired from the Air Force, that was happened. Medical records are complicated. But the doctor in Hays, Kansas, had never treated another patient with myotonic muscular dystrophy. And I talked to him about it, and he says, "I know that's what you say, and I'm going to do some research to see what we can do with it." And then I talked to him the next time, and he wants to send off a blood test to confirm that she has myotonic muscular dystrophy. I'm like, "That's been in her records since 1989. It's there, I promise." And he says to me, "We want to confirm it, because if she has myotonic muscular dystrophy, I don't know that there's much we can do." And the girl who had prayed for healing every time at wishing wells, and the girl who had gotten angry at God for taking away her brother, and then the girl that healed through poetry and life and love and community was standing at a precipice. Faith and an incurable disease. Hope and meaning and a disease that you'd had since birth, that my mother had since birth, that was going to take her life. That had already taken my brother's life, that somehow I didn't have, and whether that was a curse or a blessing was maybe still up in the air. But I came to the point where my heart knew my mother couldn't get better, that I couldn't will it. It wasn't a matter of willpower. It wasn't a matter of working hard enough. And all my prayers were, thy will be done. And they were like 10-second prayers, because I wasn't telling God anything else. There were no thank yous, no pleases, no hi, how you doing? It was just, thy will be done. That's all I can handle right now. So God, please handle it, whatever happens. But it was painful, and it was scary, and it was unknown. And yet there was this kernel of hope, because my mother, she knew that I would need her faith to carry on. And while she was on a ventilator, she couldn't talk. But her mother came in from New Mexico and was singing her hymns. And they sang I'll Fly Away the day before. And my mother, in the morning when she had less sedative, was really pretty aware. And my mom was sitting there with me, and she did this. And I said, Mom, you saying fly away? You want me to leave? And she said, no. And then she pointed to herself, and she said, go home. And she told me she wanted to fly away. And she was referencing a hymn within a faith system that gave me an assurance for where she'd go. Because look at these words. What a beautiful gift my mother gave me, telling me she was ready. She said, to a home on God's celestial shore, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. And this stanza in particular, picture a woman who hasn't left her bed for a month because she's hooked to a ventilator, hooked to a machine, and can't do it on her own. When the shadows of this life have gone, I'll fly away. Like a bird from prison bars has flown, I'll fly away. That's the message my mother gave me. That I'll be okay, that I know where I'm going, that I'm hopeful, that I'm happy, and that I will be like a bird from prison bars have flown. And I told you about the first dream, so I'm going to add to this. I know I'm probably short on time. But my second dream that I want to tell you about is my mother's dream. And 2 nights before the doctor can schedule the time to pull out the ventilator, my mother has a dream of my brother. And she tells me in the morning, she said, I have good dreams. I'm like, that's great, Mom. What'd you dream about? And she mouthed my brother's name, Dustin. And then she does this number. And it looks like Dustin's running and jumping. And then she says, yeah, Dustin's running and jumping. And then she does this. I'm like, what's that mean, Mom? But she keeps doing it, moving it up just a little bit every time. And I'm like, what do you mean, Dustin? Dustin Waters? And then she shakes her head yes. And I'm like, Waters. And then this day, she's actually coherent enough to write. And I kept this piece of paper in my classroom for years after, and I still have it. But in shaky handwriting, she writes, Dustin waters the gardens. And I remember that dream of my brother in Carlsbad coming to me to tell me he was okay. And that dream when my mother knows that her life support is soon to be removed. Her son came to welcome her home and tell her that it would be okay. That the wheelchair wasn't going to be in heaven, that he could run and jump and water the gardens, and that she wouldn't need a ventilator and be tied to a bed after that release. So I was set on the path, and my mother was set to have her ventilator removed, and I was preparing for one of the hardest days in my life. And this is where a psalm of life became very important to me again. So here's your second reading. I know I switched the order on you. But I want to read from one of the last chapters from my mother. And this is going to include the Psalm of Life poem. And it's going to be as honest of a recollection as I can give you of the day where I sit in a room and watch my mother die. I swallowed it down. I tugged Eli closer to my chest. My mind began to recite a poem I've had memorized since age 16. Shortly after Dustin died. I recite the poem in my head when I have to wash my hands for 2 minutes. I recited this poem when I was nervous before batting in softball. During labor with Eli, that's my son, he's 4. I recited this poem to relax. A Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. What was life's goal? What were we doing here in my mother's hospital room? Were we freeing ourselves of the worst electronic burden, allowing our normal lives to progress by putting my mother in the grave? Why was I so confident in telling others that my mom was ready to die? Was I ready to let her die? Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Mom was going home to heaven. Her body would die. Without machines, it would have already been dead. Mom dreamed of heaven, of her son watering the garden. She was not afraid. She did not fear death. She stood at the door, ready to welcome in death as a release from the earthly prison her weakened body had become. Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act that each tomorrow find us farther than today. Mom's tomorrows were no more. She wasn't going to get farther than she was today. Her body would no longer get stronger, unless there was a miracle once the ventilator were removed, unless her body remembered how good it felt to take her own breath, and her spirit surged into her lungs and pumped breath into a body that suddenly remembered how to function. Art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. A miracle? Shouldn't expect a miracle. A miracle could have come a month ago, last night, or at my mother's birth. Why would this day be any different? Her weakness was written into her genetic code. God had made her this way. It was not so tragic to die in the way God made us, was it? In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb-driven cattle. Be a hero in the strife. My mother, had she been moved along like cattle? Was it life at all to live through delirium, sedative, and pain medication? She had broken through it. She had told me she wanted to fly away. She had told her mother. She had mustered the courage to sing a song of faith to her family. She knew what faced her. She did not go like a cow to the slaughter. She came as a daughter summoned with her father to a dream of her son dancing in heaven. She did not face death like a cow. She stood aware with her family, knowing where she was going, trusting in her faith's reward. Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God overhead. My mother was still here in the present moment. I squeezed her hand. I had this time. I held my son. I would remember my mother. She had given me life. She had taught me how to read, held me as I cried, been there on my wedding day, and welcomed Eli into the world hours after his birth. The future may be feared. It would be scary without my mother. It would be better, too, in ways once she was gone. We could heal, move forward, and raise Eli without going to a long-term intensive care unit 3 times a week. Life had many unknowns. The future was a head swirl of chaos, guaranteed pain and a time of mourning. But this moment, I still had this moment. My mother was here. She was alive, awake. She was alert. The doctor came in. He smiled. He seemed pleasant. I'm not sure I've ever met him before. I don't remember his face. Mom looked so relieved to see him. She melted into his smile. Excuse me. Dad leaned in to absorb the doctor's words. The doctor checked all the vital signs, pulled the remaining monitor from her finger, and asked if we were ready. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. My son began to mouth at my shirt. My husband joked in a light-hearted voice, I think I'm ready, but my son seems hungry. Do you want me to step out of the room so you can feed him? The doctor asked politely. I squirmed a bit, squeezed Mom's hand, then released it to grab the nursing pillow from behind my chair. I'll just feed him here, if you don't mind. I don't want to make my mother wait any longer. The doctor nodded his head. I looked into Eli's eyes, stared in the mystery of a young life just beginning, dependent on his mother in every day of his life. I wiped my finger along his hairline, traced the curve of his cheek gently, and then pressed my thumb to his lip, which he instinctively tried to suck. I positioned him on his pillow and led him to feed. As my body rushed milk out to nourish my son, I felt the calm of doing what I was made to do. Feeding my son made the questions stop. Oxytocin rushed through my body. My head felt light with joy. My heart felt at peace. I felt needed, wanted, and comfortable. Life would go on. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing over life's solemn main, a shipwrecked and forlorn brother, seeing shall take heart again. My mother faced death with courage and still gave me her unwavering love. I too could face life with courage. I could love my child as my mother loved me. I could nourish my son with the milk of life as my mother prepared to take her last breath. Jolynn looked at Randy. She told him she loved him. He said he would love her forever, that he would never forget her, that she was the best wife he ever could have had, and that he'd never replace her. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. The doctor had finished unattaching all the tubes, standing next to the ventilator machine. He unstrapped the Velcro around my mother's neck that was holding the ventilator in place to provide her breath. Do you want to take this out, or should I? Finality, she ripped that tube from her throat and threw it off to the side. She smiled the proudest, most glorious smile I had seen on her in years. She looked at me, passed her eyes over Eli, looked at Daniel, rested her eyes on my father, then shut them, still smiling as she drifted off to meet her maker. Still achieving, still pursuing, learned to labor and to wait. The interval between her breaths slowly became longer. Her chest movement diminished. Dad held her hand the entire time, sometimes saying her name, sometimes saying he loved her, sometimes crying. I nursed my son, filled with the odd ethereal satisfaction of a mother feeding her newborn child. We sat there watching Mom rest peacefully. The minutes passed with tension rising between her ever more shallow breaths. I shifted Eli to the other side. I reached out to hold Mom's hand. Ice. So it was done. She's gone to water the gardens. I bet right now she's running and jumping with Dustin. My father sobbed into his burly knuckles. It went too fast. It all went so fast. It was my Aunt Carla who called the nurse in. And that's an honest reading from the hardest day of my life. But a day that, because poetry was written by someone connected to the Spirit, because poetry was embraced by a young girl looking for purpose, it was a moment that my son, who needed me because he was 2 months old, 3 months old, gave me an affirmation that we go on, that the grave is not its goal, that through words, through honest reflection, through philosophy and poetry, that we can heal. And I'll be honest, poetry and faith has helped me through. But when I look at From My Mother and I think about the 3.5 years I put into this book, I look at my psychologist, my therapist right here, because writing was the pathway to healing for me. And I hope that that writing can help others look at end-of-life questions and healing. But I've learned so much about the path that I've been on and what I've learned. And I'm learning things about other people that I didn't know I put into the story. And I'm hoping they find things too. And here's one of the most important messages in what poetry and writing have meant for me and in the messages of From My Mother. And this is a universal theme, but my mother, when she wanted to quit working at Walmart because her legs started hurting, I said, Mom, you can't quit. I got to have new basketball shoes so I fit in high school. When my mom was dealing with chronic depression, diagnosed depression after her son with a terminal disease that she gave him, that she passed on, when she was dealing with those feelings, I said, Mom, you got to get over the loss of Dustin. You still got me to raise. And it was hard to love without judgment. And it's still hard to love without judgment. But this is perhaps the most important verse I could bring to any sermon that I talk about, and maybe my favorite in the Bible. But this is from James 2:12-13. And it's a reminder to all of us, that lesson I learned with my mother. Speak and act as those who will be judged by the law of freedom. For judgment without mercy will be shown to the one who hasn't shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And really, this is a story where mercy triumphs over judgment, because it wasn't about my mother's accomplishments. It wasn't about her abilities. It wasn't about my willpower trying to force something to happen. It was about love. It was about mercy. It was about taking those moments at the end to enjoy washing my mother's hair and feeling honored to comb it, for enjoying her, for the love that we shared, for those gifts that she'd given me in the time. Mercy triumphed over judgment. Now, it might have been a little late in my case where she was in the hospital, and there were many times I could have been kinder to my mother. But because of her faith and her strength in her last days in my life, I'm trying to make it true that mercy triumphs over judgment. Thank you for your time.
I have a brief